College Football Nerds, Week 13, Top 10, otherwise known as the segment where we make every Notre Dame fan in America mad. I wish every Notre Dame fan in America was mad and came and watched our videos and gave us the numbers. Even though it's funny, y'all kept saying y'all last week, but I've got Notre Dame ahead of Florida and A&M. So just direct all the hate mail to Josh's P.O. Box and not mine. I'm going to give my top 10. You're going to give your top 10, and then we're going to talk off of it. It's been a great format for us so far this year. We're going to do it again. Alabama, Ohio State, Notre Dame was my last week, so I realized I was reading off the wrong thing. I flipped Notre Dame and Ohio State this week. So, starting over. Alabama, Notre Dame, Ohio State, Texas A&M, Clemson, Florida, BYU, Indiana, Georgia, and Oklahoma. Give me yours.
Mine is Alabama, Ohio State, Texas A&M, Florida, Notre Dame, Clemson, BYU, Georgia, Oklahoma, and Auburn.
So I dropped Ohio State to third because right now you and I both agree that you have to have an elite offense to win a national championship, to win a playoff game. You have to have a great offense to beat an Ohio State, to beat an Alabama. Notre Dame right now, will you at least give me this? Notre Dame's got a better defense than Ohio State.
I would agree with that.
I still think Ohio State's a playoff team, but I don't know that Notre Dame isn't. And Notre Dame had a win over a Clemson team that, even banged up, I think is better than Indiana. So for those reasons, I've shuffled the board a little bit, but still both of these would be in playoff contention. I'm going to give you an opportunity to speak to the Notre Dame fans you angered last week that came at us with the pitchforks and the torches. I'm going to give you that floor right now. Let her rip.
My answer to this is pretty simple. It's not about me hating Notre Dame as much as me being really high on Texas A&M and Florida. I think Florida is a very, very good team. I think if Florida played Notre Dame today, I think Florida would probably win that game. I also think Florida would have beaten Clemson when Notre Dame played them. Clemson is their own issue, and we'll get to that in a second. Texas A&M is problematic to rank because I can't feel that I can put A&M behind Florida, given that A&M beat Florida. I think Florida is better than Notre Dame. I'm not quite sure if Texas A&M is or is not better than Notre Dame, but I will say this: Texas A&M, is coming off a game they won 48-3. They've played well all year. They've kind of had their games where they're winning by a couple touchdowns, and we sort of see them as struggle games. To be blunt, they're playing a tough schedule. They've played Alabama. They've played Florida. They split those games. Notre Dame has played one top 10 team and gone 1-0. A&M has played two. They've gone 1-1. How do you compare 1-1 to 1-0? I don't know. I just feel like right now they're a better team, and I think Florida's a better team. And I think that's because of how good A&M and Florida is. And I really think A&M is underappreciated. But I will say this: if A&M doesn't dominate LSU this weekend, my opinion's going to change. My expectation in our preview video is that A&M is going to destroy LSU, and that's where I think they're at. And if they don't, that's going to change my opinion of them. The last thing I'll say is I'm not sure what to do with Clemson, and I've got them back there behind Notre Dame. They looked like an elite team early. They didn't look good in a lot of ways against Notre Dame. The defense has not looked good all year, and it looked even worse. And the offense was very one-dimensional in the passing game. So I'm also not sold on Clemson. It's just a logjam, and comparing conferences is almost impossible.
And to your credit, you said last week, and I don't think Notre Dame fans caught this, that you would have, if playoffs were today, Notre Dame would be in the playoffs. And I think that's important to note, that you are obviously giving them credit for the win and for being undefeated at this point. So the rest of it, and look, people want to say that they have an objective ranking system for ranking 132 teams or however many it is in a year where there are no out-of-conference games. They're crazy. You do not have one. Right now, it is a little bit of merit, a little bit of eye test, a little bit of, transitive property, which is scary. Another one, if you shoot down the list a little bit, for me, I got Cincy out. And we put him in, I think, a little bit against our better judgment after a couple of weeks in the early part of the season where we didn't have him in there because we were worried about them offensively. And what I heard all weekend or all Saturday night and today was, look, Cincy got their big win over Central Florida. And I think we know that it's 2020 and not 2017. And this is not UCF 2017. So I think a 3-point win over now 5-3 UCF is not the thing that puts you in the playoffs or puts you in our top 10 radar. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is another game where Cincinnati failed to have good production on both sides of the ball. This one, UCF focused much more on the run, and Cincinnati did have good passing numbers, particularly in chunks, but they didn't have a balanced offense. And I haven't seen it yet this year. When you're comparing it to other top 10 teams, it's not enough. It's just not enough, in my view, to pass these other teams, in particular in view of like BYU, who BYU is destroying people. They're dominant on offense. They're dominant on defense. I question the competition level, but I respect the fact that you're dominant in every phase. Cincinnati doesn't have that. And I'll piggyback too that, like you said, people want to point out like Sagarin at us and all this stuff. Look, all those models are based off relational matrices, okay? So you have, your team plays this team plays some other team, and you beat this team by 30. You know that Fresno State isn't very good. Look at how the Pac-12 did against their out-of-conference versus how your conference did against out-of-conference, and it kind of normalizes based off that. We have 0 out-of-conference games in the SEC. We have 0 in the Big Ten. We have 0 in the Pac-12, though we may get some. Those matrices are broken, literally mathematically broken, and they must assume that all conferences are equal unless there is a straight-up adjustment for recruiting ranking or last year's results. Most of them don't do that, like Sagarin doesn't. So stop telling me that X team is higher than Sagarin, or like A&M is really low in Sagarin versus Notre Dame or something. The ratings between conferences literally mathematically mean nothing if you compare the SEC to any other conference. The ratings only matter within the SEC, and that's just due to the mathematical relationships involved. So BYU totally isolated from these other conferences. I don't know what to do with them, but at least they're dominant in a way Cincinnati is not.
Yeah, and it will also note, we've said this in the past, where our model differs and where our top 10 metrics that are highly subjective differ from a Sagarin that ranks a strength and schedule, which is a component of how they rank the team. That metric is based on an average team's ability to go 6-6 and make a bowl against your record, which is not what we're doing here. We're talking about, and why we like S&P Plus a lot more, is an average team's chance of going undefeated against your record. How many teams do you play that could beat an elite team? That's what measures whether or not you've played a tough schedule, and by extension, whether or not you are a good team. So my top 10, and this is hard, and this is where I think you can sink your teeth in a little bit too. I'm rounding out my top 10 with Indiana, Georgia, Oklahoma. A lot of people are going to drop Indiana because they're going to do the thing that I hate that pollsters do. They're going to say, okay, well, you have a loss now, and you weren't a brand name that we loved, so this loss confirms our bias that you weren't a top 10 team. The question I have is, when you see Oregon struggle with UCLA, or you see Miami beat Virginia Tech by 1 point, do we really think one of those teams is going to play within one score of Ohio State? Gun to your head, you're going to say no. You're going to say they're going to lose by 20 points. So I don't like saying Indiana's got a loss, let's drop them. I like saying Indiana lost by 7 to the number 2-3 team in the country. Let's move them up a little bit, because do we think BYU gives them a tighter game? Are we sure that BYU scores 35 on Ohio State? I don't know. I don't know. So talk a little bit about the back end of your top 10 and sort of the struggles that you had putting that together to round this episode out.
Yeah, and I've got the same problems that you're talking about. There's a bit of a logjam around 10, and then I think behind this, there's a lot of noise without a lot to show for it. I didn't put Indiana in my top 10 just because, quite frankly, when you watch that game, I felt like Indiana was kind of lucky to keep it as close as they were. And that's not to say they're bad. I gave them a lot of consideration for the top 10. It's also hard to rank them against teams like Oklahoma and Auburn that, yes, they've got 2 losses, but they've played twice as many games. So, can you penalize somebody for getting a loss just because they played more? I don't know that that's fair either. And I think they're better teams right now than Indiana. I think Indiana is a good defensive team. I think they played really well in that game. They played well against Penn State. Didn't really matter much because we know Penn State's terrible. And I think they're kind of inconsistent. Georgia, to me, probably would have fallen back, and maybe Indiana would have been more in that role if it wasn't for last week. I got to eat some crow verbally in a lot of places because JT Daniels showed up for Georgia. He showed up in a big way in how he was able to hit deep shots. He was able to do some stuff underneath. I'm a bit hesitant still, and I know a lot of Georgia fans are crowing that I said I wasn't sure that. I said in Twitter that he may not be, that was my exact words, may not be as good as a healthy Bennett. And I said seriously, because it sounded like an exaggeration. I just wasn't sure, given that his QB rating at USC wasn't any better than what Bennett had. Really, he'd struggled at USC. That was the takeaway. The problem is he played Mississippi State that had 49 scholarship players. He played a Mississippi State that had walk-ons at safety and that was bringing 6 to 8 guys every play and playing cover 0 because they realized if they dropped into coverage, their walk-on players were busting coverage or getting burned so badly that they just couldn't give any time to cover. It was a weird game. But that game gave me enough confidence that maybe Georgia's getting better offensively. They're getting worse defensively, which is the thing that got underrepresented, but I can sort of justify them being there. Without that game, Indiana would be ahead of Georgia. That's the long and short of it. Oklahoma did really well against Oklahoma State. It's funny, people ragged on us for getting that wrong. Our model had that 41-29. Spencer Sanders goes down for Oklahoma State and their offense craters. And you can maybe say that's a 2-touchdown difference, given how ridiculously ineffective the backup was at 3.4-ish yard per attempt, I think. But I do think Oklahoma's playing really good ball. They've sort of rounded into form. I don't know that Ramondre Stevenson was that vital. He was like a 2.5 yard per carry back until the fourth quarter. People have chirped at us about him and Perkins and how he didn't ignore him in the previews. One, we don't talk about individual players that much. 2, when we do, we only talk about guys that are really proven. No, beating up Kansas doesn't mean a lot. I think Stevenson is going to be, Ramondre is going to be the guy for them going forward. But I do think Perkins is the guy that really made an impact. I think Stevenson's just the main back. And then Auburn, like I said, they've been sort of flirting around that if they kept 2 losses, given their schedule and given the way they were improving, I felt like they were going to move up. They're a better, more all-around good team than Miami right now. They've shown a lot of balance the past few weeks. The defense is playing well. I don't know how they're going to handle the Iron Bowl, and I don't predict it to be particularly close. But a not particularly close 42-24-ish win is the same thing A&M did. That won't shock me from Auburn, and I'm not sure a lot of teams are even going to be able to do that to Alabama right now. I think it's completely justified to have them in 10, more than anything, just because I don't think there's anybody else behind them that is clearly better.
And I think that there's 8 to 15 are the same team. So, y'all put whoever you want in there. A couple of things on your points. One, Auburn, I agree. They were right there for me too. I don't think they would beat Oklahoma, which is why I had Oklahoma there and not Auburn. They did not beat Georgia, and that game was not close, so I have a hard time putting them ahead of Georgia. I think that one thing that I like that we do that pollsters don't do is we don't look at your win-loss record that much. We look more at who you've played. And BYU right now hasn't played anybody, and they're benefiting from it. The same thing with Coastal Carolina and Cincinnati. I know it makes y'all mad, but it's true. On the flip side, I will say Auburn has been lucky to not have another loss or 2 on their record, but they have played more quality teams. On Oklahoma, look, we said going into that in our preview that Oklahoma State's offense was terrible. It was statistically they were hiding some things, but especially that pass offense was terrible. And then their quarterback goes down early in the game, and you can't tell me that didn't have something to do with it. Now, we both still picked Oklahoma to win that game, which is funny because we're getting killed on Twitter from some Oklahoma fans being smug about this, like we picked Oklahoma to get killed. We pick Oklahoma to win. Oklahoma State's quarterback goes down. Oklahoma wins. And they're like, oh, yeah, see, maybe put some respect on Oklahoma's name next time. Like, look, don't lose to Kansas State and Iowa State, and we will. But it depends on who you want Oklahoma to be. If you're saying right now Oklahoma is a dark horse playoff contender if they win the Big 12, I'm not having it. I'm just not, because your big win is Oklahoma State, who beat Tulsa 16-7. Like, you have an elite offense. You always have. You always will. You have a better defense, but you are not, like, you don't have the resume with those two losses to tell me that you're a playoff team. And maybe they're not saying that, and I'm okay with that. I do think they're a top 10 quality team. I do think that in a bowl game against another top 10 team, they could give them a run or beat them, even beat them soundly if you got the good rattler. So I'm not mad about that. I just think it's funny that we're getting killed. Somebody said that basically our take got exposed, and all our take said was you can't take anything good or bad from beating up on the 114th and 125th best defenses in the country. And that if Alabama lost a couple of games to mediocre teams and then rolled Vanderbilt and came up talking about how they had a great player that was all the difference, y'all would laugh us out of the building, and you should. All right, give me your parting shot on this week's top 10. I think you had an interesting point about Texas A&M. Who are you looking for this week to see if there's opportunities for big movement shuffling for next week?
So I give you sort of three examples here. One, Clemson Pitt, I think is pretty interesting. Pitt has a really good defensive line that could give Clemson some issues. And Clemson historically has dominated the regular season when they can run the ball well. And I'll be curious to see how they can do it if Pitt can actually stop the run in a way that most teams haven't. I'll also say Pitt had a long layoff. It's affected the way people view them, and they dominated Virginia Tech. They may be a team that's kind of turning the corner and can give us some insight. Georgia, I want to see JT Daniels repeat his performance against South Carolina team that's not particularly good. And I'll say finally, A&M LSU to me is probably the biggest one. If A&M is able to dominate that game, then they're going to justify themselves. And if A&M can't dominate the game, then I'm going to begin to think a little bit that maybe that Florida game was kind of a...
I like the Clemson one the most because they, too, have been out of sight, out of mind after losing to Notre Dame. I want to see a pissed-off Clemson. That's what I want to see, because I want them to get me excited for Clemson Notre Dame rematch. That it's so funny because ratings are down across the board, but that game ratings are going to be through the roof because people are going to start to think end of the season. NBA regular season, nobody cared, but postseason people kind of started to care because it's real, because it matters for something. It means we might actually get to a finish line. People are going to be locked in on that game. Ratings are going to be through the roof. It's going to be a lot of fun to watch. I want to see that Clemson is pissed off and they are heading into that matchup with some intent. So I think those are good ones. I'm with you on A&M. I don't think they're going to blow them out. But I also think they're really good, but I also have them behind Notre Dame. All right, y'all, let us know. Give us your top 10. You Oklahoma fans, if you came here from Twitter or from our preview to hear some kind of crow or something, let us know what you think. You can take our point by point and tell us where we're wrong, but back it up with data and take our points genuinely and not how some of y'all did on Twitter. All right, y'all, that's my rant for this week. Thanks so much. Have a great week. God bless.